In this video, I'm going to be discussing agriculture as it was conducted in the English open fields. This video is going to include some really nice, grown-up, nuanced, complicated history, in particular, a really subtle notion of property rights that we're going to discuss in some depth. I think this material is crazy interesting, and I hope you agree. Now, to start, from the title, you might be wondering, why are we going to spend so much time talking about this weird little island? Let me reiterate. We're discussing England in such detail at this point in the class for really two reasons. First of all, the complexity that we're going to examine here turns out to be kind of canonical in the way historians think about farming in almost any context. And so these lessons are applied broadly elsewhere. But also, second, we know just around the corner what's coming is a description of this really magical change in both agriculture and industry. And what's really interesting, and what we're going to discuss mostly today, is that this weird little island and the way that it conducted agriculture was already kind of weird before these revolutions even happened. So before the agricultural revolution, English farms were already larger, more productive, and they had this really peculiar and different social structure that you could group into three maybe primary groups or important groups, which were a class of rich landlords or gentry, a class below them of what we're going to call yeoman farmers, which are usually described as small owner-occupiers of land, and also a class of landless farm laborers. And in addition to that, what's kind of murky is that there's a class of many, many tenant farmers as well. Now, I want to spend a couple slides talking to you about property in England. And there's a few reasons I want to do this. One is because it's going to explain some of why it's hard to form a general description of this particular context. But also, if any of you decides to go to law school, God help you, English property law and its complexities form the bedrock of any common law country's property law, for example, that of the United States. So if you go to law school in the United States, you take this class called Estates and Trusts, and it's a big part of the bar exam, and a lot of this stuff is on it. So let me try to explain why English property law is so complicated. Well, it all starts with the fact that way back in the medieval times or even before, technically, all land in England was ultimately owned by the king. And what feudalism was about is this idea of property wherein the king will allow certain people, for example, knights, to use part of the king's land in exchange for service. So if you're a knight, that's military service. But there are other kinds of service that I'll discuss in a moment. Now, two concepts that I'm going to go over in the next two slides that are central to understanding this are the notion of tenure and the notion of an estate. Now, these sound really similar, but what tenure is the agreement over service in exchange for the right to hold land. So in the case of a knight, for example, that tenure arrangement is about military service. The notion of an estate is another part of the property right. The estate defines the right to sell or lease or dispose of land after death and its use rights. So essentially it's transfer rights and use rights. Okay? So let's first talk about the notion of tenure. So I'm going to divide notions of tenure into free tenure and unfree tenure. So free sounds like, you give nothing, but that's not quite right. So free means that the kinds of services that the person gives in exchange for that land use is fixed in nature and duration. So it's very clearly defined. So for example, knight tenure is a kind of free tenure. It's super fixed in nature, it's very clear, and the duration is clear as well. However, the most common kind of tenure that was employed in England was called socage tenure. And this could be a variety of services or payments for the lord, not necessarily military service, but what's critical again is that it's fixed in nature and duration. Now, that is a pretty clearly defined notion of service, which contrasts with unfree tenure. In unfree tenure, the nature of the services or payments is not fixed, so it can be changed over time or at the lord's whimsy. and it usually requires some kind of literal service on the Lord's land. Okay, so, and there's below unfree a few additional kind of subdivisions. So the one you really don't want to have if you're a tenant is at will unfree tenure. So the Lord can basically ask whatever they want of you whenever they want. It's totally at will. Now, a very common kind of tenure, in fact, the most common kind of tenure, was called customary or copyhold unfree tenure. So what this happens is there's a manorial court roll, sort of a record of the estate, a record of the land holding. And when land is transferred, what happens is the Lord is going to make a note in the book and give the tenant a copy of that. Okay? And so that copy, that book, that manorial roll is going to have the nature of the agreement stored, and the tenant doesn't get the original, but they get a copy. And what that's going to entail is that there's an agreement that's sort of by custom of the manor and copy of the court roll. So there are some rights that are customary, and actually the courts will defend tenants for their customary rights in such cases, even though that seems like a less secure kind of property right. The technical term for payments like rents that go to the Lord is incidence of tenure. And in some cases, like for free tenure, these could be like really arbitrary and just by custom, like a single peppercorn is like the most famous one that you might have to get. But others, they could be literal like annual rent payments, like we're more familiar in a modern day context. So by the 16th century in England, most free tenure was sockage, and the most common unfree tenure was copyhold tenure. Okay, so that's what tenure means. Now let's talk about the notion of the estate. And recall again, the estate is the transfer and use right. And so why do estates exist? Well, it becomes from this really weird fiction, right? That the king is the ultimate owner of land, and so people can't own land, but you can create an entity called an estate, which has these rights. Anyway, that's abstract and crazy. You can learn more in law school. Okay, just like for tenancy, there are two kinds of estates. There's freehold estates and non-freehold estates. A freehold estate is one that doesn't have a forever duration. It has an indefinite duration. So it has some uncertainty, and we'll talk about why. Okay, so freehold estates are inheritable. A fee simple freehold estate is one that can be transferred and inherited without any restrictions. A fee tail freehold estate is one that can be transferred, but with some restrictions on the inheritance. So you may think that sounds crazy, but if you've watched Downton Abbey, right, the estate in Downton Abbey has a tail, which is that they can only inherit it to a male heir, I think, something like that. Anyway, these are real. Fee simple is most common. Okay, for example, I have fee simple tenancy in my house, meaning I own my house. Fee simple is totality of ownership. I can transfer it however I want, and I can use it however I want. Now, besides freeholds, there is also a life estate version of freehold. And in that kind of freehold estate, the duration of the estate is defined by either your life or someone else's life. And you see how these introduce, so this is a notion of indefinitency. They introduce some uncertainty into the end date, because I think one doesn't know when you're exactly going to die, and you definitely don't know when like someone else is going to die. That's a really weird notion, is it, this pour atre vie kind of life estate. But the whole point is to introduce a little uncertainty into the end date of the estate. And why you want to do that is if you know exactly when the end date is of when you're going to be responsible for a property, what you do is you stop making improvements, right? Like actually, even if you buy or sell a house, right? Like when we bought our house, the people who sold our house to us, when they knew the end date, they stopped mowing the yard. So it's just like a total mess when we took over. And so they're trying to introduce some uncertainty to take care of that problem of incentives. Okay. In contrast to freehold estates, there are non-freehold, and these have a definite defined duration, right? Either totally at the will of the landlord, okay? Or for a certain amount of years. So I wanted to just show you guys that this stuff is real, okay? This is part of the warranty deed for my house in Middlebury, Vermont. And what I want to show you here is that the use of the word tenant, when it could mean owner, persists, right? So William and I, are tenants by the entirety of our house. So tenants, okay, we are occupying this land, and by the entirety is a kind of fee simple, meaning that we can transfer it, but I can't unilaterally transfer it without my husband's permission, and vice versa. So that's what that means. I think that's pretty cool. So let's talk now about why this matters, why I spent so much time talking about it, okay? So by the period that we're going to be discussing, by the 17th and 18th centuries, most land in England was held as customary copyhold tenure with estates for years or lives, and rents were paid as an entry fine plus an annual rent. This entailed a particular division of responsibilities between landlords and tenants. And in this division of responsibilities, landlords were responsible for what we would call major capital improvements, right? The draining, the clearing, those kinds of major improvements to the land. But the tenant farmers paid for the small kinds of capital, seeds, tools, these kinds of things. So that's how they tried to divide the incentives and the responsibility. Heritability in particular really matters, as you can see, for the incentives. If I know that my tenancy, my estate is going to come to an end, I'm going to stop making improvements. And furthermore, the usage rights, that other part of estates, that has serious consequences for who gets to enjoy the benefits of the output and how those benefits are distributed. Now, these concepts are already relatively complicated, and they get more complicated. I didn't tell you that a particular kind of tenancy entailed a certain kind of estate, because they don't, and they were mixed and matched. And now we're going to take those property rights system and superimpose them onto the most common method of farming organization. And I think this is crazy fascinating, okay? In medieval England, more than half of the farmland was organized into a system called the open field system. Open fields were a system of administering landholds on the level of the entire village, okay? And this has a few really important properties. First property is there was a really strict division of arable and pasture lands in the open fields, okay? Animals and crops did not mix. That's an important characteristic. Second, the entire village rotated together. And the way they did this was they divided the entire village's arable land into 3 gigantic crops for rotation, divided into one entire giant field of wheat and rye, one or the other. So one giant field of wheat, another giant field of either barley, oats, beans, or peas, and then, critically, an entire field left open as fallow. The entire village had to agree to the rotation plan. An amazing amount of coordination, okay? And the village would also have, again, strictly divided arable and pasture. So they would have their own grass under meadow and a common pasture. And so everybody's animals would be let loose onto the whole common pasture or the fallow and other fields after harvest to collect fertilizer. I think that's really amazing, right? This idea of commons, so common use right over the pasture. This means that there is common decision making for the labor for big projects and for this rotation scheme. But notice, okay, this is not communism, right? The tenants that are part of this open field system control their own output, right? There's not a communal sharing of output. I'm going to now superimpose a video here where I'm going to draw you some pictures of how this open field system worked. I'm going to quickly sketch for you now a typical village using this open field scheme with a 3-field system. So what we have here in our village is we're going to have arable land, which I'm going to show you in this circle here, And then over here, I've maybe got my pasture where I keep my animals. And maybe I've got some additional meadowland where I'm growing grasses and hay. Now in the arable land given by this circle, we will divide all the arable land into 3 gigantic fields. In this top field will be only grown wheat or rye, whatever the village wants. Maybe down here in this field to the left will be our oats field, or I'd be growing barley or peas or beans. And this final field, critically, this is our fallow field, right? This is the field that's allowed to rest. Now, how this works is villagers, farmers, would have strips within each of these fields. And so if I'm a farmer and I have this strip here, this strip is growing oats this year. Maybe I have this strip too, it's growing wheat, or if rye, if that's what the village is doing. And this field that's mine is fallow. And every year, the whole village is going to rotate. So all this land that was growing oats this year will be fallow next year. And similarly for the other fields. We all have to agree to do this together. Okay, so given that explanation of the way the open fields worked, I want to talk to you about this really fascinating concept of what's going inside of here. So I talked about how me as a farmer, I would have for sure a strip in each of these big open fields. There are no fences among these open fields, okay? But what's kind of interesting is that there's different kinds of scattering. So a farmer having strips in each of the 3 open fields is called scattering across. But farmers could also have more than one strip within a given field. That's called scattering within. It's interesting as an economic puzzle to think about why there would be both scattering across and scattering within. Well, scattering across is necessary to make sure that the farmer has output every single year given the rotation scheme, right? If I only have fields in, say, the oat field, then there's going to be years when I don't have any output. And same if I don't make sure I have output in every single one of the fields. I want to make sure that I have oats and wheat every year, for example. What about scattering within? We're not sure, to tell you the truth. One common explanation is this is a way to diversify a crop portfolio. Perhaps I have some uncertainty about the quality of each individual strip within a given open field. If I have many strips within that open field, it's more likely that I'm going to have a good output in at least one of them. It's sort of a diversification of a crop portfolio. I think that's fascinating. I want to show you now some evidence that this really happened, okay? So this is a map of Holcombe, the village of Holcombe, and in Norfolk. These are open fields, and this is a map of basically how this was set up in 1590. And you can actually see the whole village land. There's a common field, and then we have several fields divided among the village, right? You can see the south field, you can see church field, there's another third field there. And so that's how that would be divided. Okay, here's another cool map. This is the village of Cuxham in Oxfordshire, a little bit later, 1767. And here you can actually see on this map not only that 3-field structure plus the meadow, but also the stripping, right? How they would divide the farmland into strips. That's really cool. Now, if you go to England and you go around the countryside, you will see the evidence of the strips, right? You will see evidence of the open field system, right? In, for example, a field like this one that's totally divided into strips, even though it's not used that way today. And, maybe even weirder, there are still common pastures where the entire village has the right to turn out their animals to pasture. A really famous one is at Cambridge. So this is the University of Cambridge. That is King's College. And when you go to King's College, right across from it, there are cows. And those are cows in the Cambridge Common Fields, which is crazy.